Welcome back, everybody, and thanks for dropping in, and thank you to everyone that has subscribed. We have hit 100. Woohoo! So one milestone out of the way. And today we're going to try and continue on the Grimdark theme, and we're going to be playing with the free model from Warhammer for April, which is an Assault Intercessor. And as usual, you collect him from the store in pieces and try and assemble the little fella. Now the idea today is to try and emulate again a Grimdark theme, but this time using a white base. So we are starting with a light primer instead of a dark primer, and we're going to go from light to dark theoretically to try and create this. Now, just a word of warning, this is not a how to, this is a how not to, because there's quite a few stuff ups along the way, and this took a fair amount of time for me to do and correct. So it's one of those sort of learning curve things where if you don't try it, you don't know how it works. So that's precisely what we've done in this instance here, trying different paint applications and certainly struggling a little bit perhaps with reactivation of the Army Painter Speed Paint 1.0 and also other methods of applying paint. Particularly, as you'll see at the end, Agrax Earthshade, which is probably a little bit too concentrated and could have been done with being watered down, but we'll get to that. So first things first, we had to assemble the little guy, as usual, trim everything up, and this is the first time I decided to try sub-assemblies because I figured it was going to be easier to get the job done in pieces rather than in its entirety. So I kept the guy's head off because the head I got didn't have a helmet, because he obviously likes his brain matter spread all over the battlefield. And there was also some items that you attach around the belt. So wacko, let's do it all in bits and pieces, including the backpack. Now, first stuff up was adding or just applying the primer, a white primer. I think there was a little bit too much water in it from when I was just testing the thing to make sure it was cleaned out and working. And so when I applied that, it came out all blotchy and it looked awful and it was thick. So I rinsed it off and it created a sort of a mottled pattern on the model, which I thought, oh, sweet. Well, actually, that was a lucky mistake. That might actually provide a bit of wear and tear appearance to the armor. But in the end, once I'd actually applied a few more coats of paint, that disappeared. So realistically, it wasn't a great idea. Don't do it. Just be cautious as you move along. Now, the idea was to give it a white base coat, but then try using some of the speed paints on top to create darkness into the sort of the small pits and lines on the armor to create those shadows. And so using the Army Painter Speed Paint white, we applied that all over the model to produce a sort of a grayish tone. But when that was complete, it really didn't sort of differentiate the panel joints and everything. So we took it a step up and tried using the next darkest grey they had, which is runic grey, and applied that across the whole model to see if that would provide a bit more contrast. Definitely it greys down the model, so he doesn't look particularly much like a White Scar or an equivalent faction. So it was like, okay, well, it's a start. You can see it does pull in the recesses, pulls away from the edges, so you do get a bit of sort of panel highlighting, which is kind of awesome. So I wasn't too disappointed with that. The next step was to then try and pinline wash and darken everything using an even darker speed paint. So this was the runic grey, Gravelord grey, and from there we just tried sort of darkening some of those smaller areas on the armor because they just looked a little bit too light. So we've done this in the past. I was hoping to try and avoid that, actually, thinking that using the speed paint, perhaps it needs to be applied thicker or a darker coat, but then you have to come back from dark to light, which I've got to do anyway, looking at it, but it seemed like a reasonable idea at the time. So that was the approach. and systematically went around the whole thing and tried to provide a weathered sort of appearance. Now, putting the speed paints over when you're trying to pin line, and if you're doing things like that, you do get tide marks, and that's unfortunate. So you've kind of got to go over it with a wet brush perhaps to try and mobilize some of the pigment so that you don't have the obvious lines that are left remaining. And unfortunately, when you do that, if you dwell too long or push too hard, use too much water, you will actually soften the other speed paint layers which were underneath. So perhaps maybe glazing over the top with a matte varnish may have actually helped. And now we're on to stuff up number 2, which was I thought I would try sponging on some white to bring back the white coloration. But in this instance here, I didn't thin the paint down. This was just the straight white air paint, and it clearly was too gloggy and provided a terrible sort of finish. And it was like, oh dear, this is not fantastic. It looks too lumpy. And it was just way too stark, and so I spent the next 20 minutes or so going in and trying to mobilize that with a wet brush to soften the transitions because it just looked disgusting. And ultimately I was able to sort of create zones of gradation so that it didn't look as horrendous, but certainly should have watered it down so that it was a progressive build up. So yeah, don't try and cut corners clearly, or think about what you're doing before you get to that stage. So yeah, not trying that again. Now we continued with the pin lining and everything else to a level where it was somewhat highlighted, and then thought, okay, well, time to actually start emphasizing some of the elements on the armor to bring that color in. And first things first is actually again using another speed paint because I wanted the translucency, using the red over the Aquila and the seal, and also the shoulders. And with the speed paints, the way they apply, they tend to pool in areas, even on flat sections, and you tend to get inconsistency in the finish, which is difficult when you're trying to do 50 little bits to be able to just apply it all quickly at once and get it very even, especially when you're trying to do the fine edges on the shoulder pads where they meet up with the rest of the white armor. So that was a bit of a faff, and ultimately it wasn't the neatest finish either, and we'll get to that in a minute with regards to what I tried to do there. Just using leather speed paint again, this time on the sort of the holster, the little pouches and the belt, and also the bag of grenades, because this guy's a grenade thrower, assault intercessor, and just one coat application of that relatively thickly, and you get a nice consistent finish. Pays to be neat when you're applying your paint. Clearly I'm not. Fortunately, again, with the speed paint you can sort of wipe it away a little bit, but you've got to be very careful, again mobilizing the other coats underneath, which were also speed paint. So again, the varnish thing perhaps would have been a good idea. Now here's a great idea, number 3, that didn't kind of work out, and that was that I'd use the Gravelord Grey, Cloudburst to pin line, because it seems to spread really well when it's diluted down, and I'd done that over a dark base which looked fantastic, but screamingly obviously blue when you're doing it over a pale grey, and it also bleeds obviously out into the white paint, so that had to be sort of rubbed back progressively. So all I was ever doing was progressive touch-ups to try and improve the look of something that I stuffed up the first time round. Then we tried some black, and it's interesting, the black isn't so black, that it seems to be not as opaque. And so later on, when it came to doing other things in black, I actually used Daler-Rowney ink. The ink seems to have a way blacker pigment and applies way better. So I was much happier with that black finish rather than just using the Army Painter black. There's a few more little details, just applying some gold and bleached bone to his little trinket that's dangling from his belt, just to tidy that up a little, make it look like it's dead, just to finish off some of the bits and pieces. And again, just using the pallid bone over the seal, just to make it look like it's parchment. Fortunately, when everything was dry, I went in and did some edge highlighting. I remembered to do it on this, but I should have done that on the armor later on. So did some edge highlighting just to provide a bit of fatigue and weathering to the leather armor to make it look a bit used. Didn't want to go too overboard with this, just a small amount because it had a nice looking texture anyway from the speed paint, which had dried in a crackly sort of fashion in part. And then on to the scone. And we started by putting some of the runic grey on to provide some highlighting of the joints and the recesses, and thought, well, we can bring that back by dabbing on and edge highlighting with the white. So he's got a mask on, and it was just a matter of one application of that seemed to do the job. And it's a hell of a lot easier than doing it when it's attached to the model, definitely. And I'd seen quite a few videos on how to do heads and using base colors and everything else, but I thought, oh, I'm not going to get too creative here. I'll just keep it simple. And thought, well, dark hair color would be good. And I put down a coat of sort of a lighter brown, but I felt like it probably wasn't dark enough, and it could have done with a little bit of assistance. So I did go over that again with a darker color to bring it to a sort of a more suitable sort of coloration that I thought for the Grimdark theme, rather than having him as almost a carrot top. So a little bit of silver on both the face mask there, on the sort of the hoses. There's other parts on the armor, like the buckle on the leather strap for the grenades, and also the chain that's dangling from his belt, so that got a touch as well. And then we just used the speed paint on the guy's head, just one coat, but it was pooling way too much in around the face mask and also the hairline. I thought, oh, that might look a bit stupid if that's really dark, so just go in with a slightly dry brush and dab that up and remove that, and then you don't end up with such an obvious sort of demarcation between his head and the hairline. I didn't want that to be too darky orange, because this particular color does stain in a sort of a more an orange color palette than sort of fleshy tone, so it was a matter of just fiddling with it. I did do another coat just on the forehead and just around the eyes ever so slightly to try and color that up a bit more. I put a little bit of a magenta in the eyes before I went to the white, and then tried dotting the eyes in, and first time round it looked disgusting, so I had to apply the white again and then redo the pupils so they were both looking in the same direction, because that clearly didn't look right. And then it was on to next stuff up, which was getting ahead of myself and trying to do the edge sort of chipping on the armor to provide fatigue, to give it that grimdark sort of look. And I went in with the black, and should have started with a white edge highlight first and then applied the black. So I was trying the sponging approach and also dabbing on, and I just used the normal Air Army Painter black, and it was just too grey. And this is where I introduced the Dalerani black ink, which produced a much richer black. And I tried to get a little bit creative and create battle damage rather than chipping the snot out of it, because the tips weren't particularly fantastic and I wasn't getting fine enough detail, it felt like. So I went in and did a black sort of mark where the damage was, suggesting that it had penetrated the armor, and then highlighted and emphasized around some of the deep sort of or the thicker black lines with some white to try and make it look like there was layers to the damage. And then it was on to assembling the model, and because I'd painted the belt, I actually had to scrape the paint off so that it would actually stick, and it took a little bit of fiddling to get that on. And lucky last was his head, and this is where we did the last stuff up, which was doing the Agrax Earthshade. I didn't actually water it down, and it looks a fair bit thick, like he's been trudging through a swamp rather than just a light coloration. But hey, at least I know if I'm doing something that comes out of a swamp, I know how to emulate the mess that it's going to make. But I thought from my own personal ideas that it might have been a little bit thinner, would have looked better. But hey, like I said, this is an exercise in learning. This is only the 5th model I've ever actually painted. So you've got to start somewhere and you've got to learn. So you might as well hit it with a brush and see what it looks like. So all in all, he doesn't look disgusting. Could be better, but relatively happy with the end result and looking forward to the next one. So thanks everyone if you got this far. And let's hope we can do some more creative content that is actually enjoyable. So thanks for watching.